Okay.
How's that? Okay.
Okay, maybe that'll work. We'll
Is it
try.
moving? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it is moving. It is moving. All right. All right. So just before moving on, I just want to acknowledge the many people who have contributed to this. So first of all, focus on my group, and you see Abdallah here sitting over there. But then we also did lots of experiments elsewhere. So at the Advanced Photon Source in Chicago, some initial measurements at MIT, and ion implantations in Helsinki, and then we work quite closely with some of our colleagues at the UKAEA in Cullen. Thermonuclear fusion promises that you might actually have a clean, safe, and almost inexhaustible energy source. The difficulty is that the materials, particularly the plasma-facing materials inside the reactor, will see some very harsh conditions, so high temperatures and intense irradiation, in particular from these neutrons, which carry most of the energy produced in the fusion reaction. Currently, sorry, I might just see if I can move this. Right. Currently, tungsten is one of the front runner materials that's considered for armor components. And in operation, you would expect that this would see this high flux of energetic neutrons. This leads to two different effects. So one is the formation of crystal defects through collision cascades. The neutrons come in, displace some tungsten atoms from their lattice positions, these bounce into their neighbors, and so on, and thereby, like a billiard ball, sort of generate this collision cascade damage. So here's an MD simulation of this from Andrea Zand. And you also get some transmutation alloying, which means that actually what started out as a pure tungsten block soon won't be a pure tungsten block anymore, but we'll have all sorts of alloying elements inside it. You'll also have high operating temperatures and an intense flux of helium and hydrogen ions and neutrons. So all of this can substantially change the properties of the material. And what we've really focused on is what the role of crystal defects in all of this is. So I'm showing here the kind of what's left in the aftermath of one of these collision cascades. So you see you have everything from individual self-interstitials to large interstitial loops. And what we would like to see, of course, is whether this agrees with experiments. So Shao Yi, a few years ago now, this is in the it's just before 2013 to 2015, did some beautiful TEM experiments where she looked at in-situ irradiation and then the accumulation of defects. And what she's plotted here are the TEM results, and superimposed on this is a triangle here of predictions of the size distribution of defects that you would have from MD. And something that you notice is that MD predicts all of these tiny defects here, right? Which TM doesn't seem to be able to see. And the question is, well, are they actually there? Is it just that TM can't see them, or they're actually, as this would suggest, just not in the material, and MD is wrong? And do these little defects matter? Because they can make up almost 80% of the total defect population. So what really this slide actually shows some data right from the start when I started working on this that really got me interested in this, because one of the scenarios where you have almost exclusively these tiny defects is if you implant with helium. So these here are some TM micrographs of pure tungsten implanted with 3000 APPM of helium. And the really interesting thing is you can see that there. Can we turn off these lights so that we can do this a little bit better, really? Brilliant, thank you. You can see that you have this kind of diffuse contrast in this TM micrograph, but you can't really pin down any defects. And if you zoom in, we thought there'd be loads of bubbles. Turns out you can't actually pin down any bubbles or any visible defects in this. Yet when you do nanoindentation, this is what you see in the unimplanted material. This is what you see, I'm showing surface topography here. This is what you see in the implanted material. So first of all, hardness almost doubles in the presence of helium. So clearly helium's done something, even though we can't actually pin down any defects. And you also see that in this case here, you've got this really localized pileup. So the fact that hardness increases says clearly these helium defects are quite good obstacles to glide dislocations. And this localized pileup suggests that, well, maybe the material kind of becomes softer when you propagate a dislocation through, but we're not quite sure what goes on. So anyway, this is where we started. And the first question was really, well, how can we quantify the number density of these defects? So we thought, well, we can't do it with TM, so let's look at other techniques. And what we resorted to is X-ray diffraction. So this is a technique called microbeam-Lauer diffraction, which allows you to measure the full elastic strain tensor with micron resolution in all three directions in samples. So you have your X-ray beam that comes in here, like this, and then your diffraction pattern would have contributions from all the bits of material along the beam that your X-rays see, right? So in order to deconfuse what comes from what depth, you scan a wire through these diffracted beams, and by subtracting the images from subsequent Y positions, it's effectively as if you were moving a slit across your diffracted signal, and you can then reconstruct what the strain at different depths is. And this is what we measured. So this here is now the distance from the sample surface. This here is strain. In green and in red are the in-plane strain components, so they're close to zero. And in blue, it's the out-of-plane strain component. You can see that this helium implantation has resulted in a huge amount of lattice swelling. Now, can I go make this? Am I allowed to make this smaller?
Yes.
Right, let me try that. So we can then go and work out what lattice swelling this actually is. The question is, how do we relate this to the underlying defects? This is where our friends from the UKAEA came in and said, well, from density functional theory, we can actually predict what the lattice strain associated with particular defects is using something called the relaxation volume of a defect. So if we can work out this relaxation volume for a specific type of defect, then the volumetric lattice strain that we get is just the number density of these defects times the relaxation volume summed over all the different types of defects that are present. Yeah. So we worked out what the relaxation volumes for all of these different types of defects are. So here vacancies, here helium interstitial defects, right? And then here helium-filled vacancies. And what you find is that the relaxation volume for a vacancy is quite small and negative, so the lattice contracts a little bit if you've got a vacancy there. The relaxation volume for an interstitial is large and positive, so it's this guy here, yeah. And actually for these helium-filled vacancies, the relaxation volumes overall are fairly small. So we can then go through and say, well, okay, can we analyze this? Can we analyze this swelling? So energetically, it should always be favorable for helium to live inside vacancies, right? Rather than interstitially in the lattice. So let's assume that everything lives in helium vacancy complexes. And you could then imagine sort of two types of defect accumulation. One, where you just have the vacancies that are retained in the material, and all the interstitials, because interstitials in tungsten are very mobile, all the interstitials escape to some surface, right? Based on what I've just told you, that would suggest that we should have a negative lattice strain or lattice swelling, so a contraction of the lattice because we have an excess of vacancies. That's not what we see. Instead, the second mode we could think of is a kind of a Frenkel mode where we retain both the interstitial and the vacancy that you make. So when you irradiate, you generate Frenkel pairs, one vacancy and one interstitial. Yeah, that makes a Frenkel pair. And if you retain both parts of this Frenkel pair in the lattice, then that should give you a lattice swelling overall, because relaxation volume of interstitials is large, vacancy small. We can do this, and we can see that actually if you had a microstructure that corresponds to about 1,500 APPM of interstitials and helium-filled vacancies, then this gives something that's quite close to the measured strength. Right. Well, we can think of lots of possible combinations of defects here that would give you exactly the same lattice strain, right? So this doesn't really help. So how can we substantiate this? One of the other things that you notice from the DFT calculations is that you also predict a small, but nonetheless measurable, hopefully, change in the elastic properties of the material. So we actually went through and predicted what the elastic constants would be for tungsten containing different types of defects. So either here, pure tungsten, tungsten with interstitial, and tungsten with helium-filled vacancies. I'm not going to go through the details of this, but what you can do overall is that you can then go and predict, if we have this microstructure that we've postulated from swelling, what would the elastic constants be? And you can see here that we predict that the elastic modulus goes down by was it 13 gigapascals-ish? So not very much, but a little bit. And Poisson ratio changes a little bit, and the anisotropy increases a little bit. And fortunately, in the lab, we have a way of actually measuring very accurately what the elastic constants of the material are. And Abdallah will talk about this, hopefully, maybe a little bit. But anyway, we can generate surface acoustic waves of sort of micron wavelength, and those allow us to interrogate what the surface acoustic wave velocity is, and we can forward predict what the surface elastic wave velocity change we would expect is if we go from pure tungsten to this damaged tungsten, and we predict a reduction of about 2%, and that's also what we see in experiments. So that suggests that actually there's maybe some sense to this defect population. The other thing you see is that there's this change in the elastic anisotropy. So our materials become very slightly more elastically anisotropic. Note, of course, from an engineering perspective, you don't care about this, but it's a great thing to test whether our model is actually correct, right? So rather than just measuring surface acoustic wave velocity in one particular direction, we actually have the ability to, if we look at a single crystalline sample, look at the propagation of surface acoustic waves in different directions, and thereby we're sensitive to the elastic constants. And what you see up here is the data now, surface acoustic wave velocity for a tungsten sample with 110 out of plane direction, and we're then measuring different directions in the plane. This is how elastic surface acoustic wave velocity varies in the unimplanted part of that sample. Down here, what you see in the implanted part. This reduction is what we had on the previous slide, yeah, 2% in average. And you can also see that the anisotropy actually here has gone up to about 1.03. We predicted 1.02. So actually, again, it's reasonable. Yeah. We were really happy when we measured this because it meant that we weren't entirely wrong the first time around. And this was about a year and a half after the previous work. So that's quite good. Anyway, so the other thing that I was really keen to look at is how deformation behavior changes, right? Now, looking at changes in deformation behavior using Berkovich indentation is it's a pain because everything is dominated by the shape of your indenter. So rather than looking at Berkovich, we said, well, okay, why don't we go down to spherical indentation? So this is here, unimplanted material. I'm looking at grains that have the 001 direction coming out of the page, yeah, so towards you. This is unimplanted, this is helium implanted, and you straight away notice that there's this dramatic change in the structure of the pileup, which with these slip steps here and much more localized pileup. You also see that the load during the indentation is much higher. We measured residual stresses around this indent as well. Suffice to say that surprisingly, in the implanted material, the residual stresses that are left behind after the dentation are actually much smaller than in the unimplanted material. But really, in order to make sense of it, you need to have a model, right, to try and interpret what's going on. So Suchandrima Das, when she was a student with me, built this crystal plasticity finite element model, where you have an indenter, and you then have this indents a block underneath. The top layer of this is ion implanted material, yeah, where we have a slightly different constitutive law, and then underneath you have unimplanted material. And in the ion implanted material, we have this slightly modified slip law here. Whoopsie daisy, that wasn't supposed to happen. So in the unimplanted material, we just say, okay, we have some critical result shear stress, and then a hardening contribution due to geometrically necessary dislocations. In the implanted material, we add this extra term, which captures the hardening due to helium implantation induced defects. Yeah. So there's a prefactor here. This captures the hardening, and actually, sorry, I know this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I'm jumping over the defect, but actually you can write out this tau 0 SF. You can actually write out in terms of the underlying defect population and actually find a number for that parameter based on the defects that are in the material. And then there's a little bit of a fudge factor here, which is that as you have your plasticity progresses, so as you get gamma here is the accumulated shear strain. Yeah, as the shear strain increases, you have some kind of softening. And that's justified because when we looked in the TEM underneath some indents, where you see those slip steps, you effectively have channels that appear to have been cleared out of irradiation defects. So you have these kind of almost perfect material channels, which is quite interesting. So clearly the dislocations remove some of your irradiation-induced obstacles. So this is here then the prediction up here from crystal plasticity. Down here are experimental maps of the surface topography from AFM, and you can see that this matches quite well. And we also, you capture this four-fold symmetry that you have because of crystallography. And we've also, I don't know if I show this on the, no, I don't show this on the previous page, but obviously we also check that we capture the low displacement behavior well. But the proof is really in the pudding on the next page, because we took that same model and said, okay, we've calibrated all of this on 001 oriented, oh gosh, I need to speed up, on 001 oriented crystal, right? If we now go to different crystal orientation, if we're right, it should match. So up here is the CPFE prediction for 001. This is 011, and this is 111 oriented crystal. And down here are the corresponding experiments. And I'm not showing the low displacement curves, but the low displacement curves match. And you can also see that we capture this effect that the pileup is much bigger for this particular orientation than for the other two. So this made me very happy when this just came out. Well, actually, to be fair, the papers both came out in 2019. There was about a year again between the original model and then this version with different orientations. All right, I'll zoom through self-ion damage because this is what we moved on to next, looking at what actually happens when you irradiate self-ions. So here I'm going to be talking about this set of samples we made. So tungsten irradiated to doses from about 10 to the -4 to 32 dPa in equal steps on a log scale, all at room temperature. And the idea really was to try and understand what's going on. First thing we did again was to measure lattice strains, and we saw something really very strange. So here I'm showing the lattice strains are out of plane swelling as a function of dPa. And you see here that initially, fine, your lattice strain increases with increasing dPa. This is what you would expect. And then something odd happens, is it doesn't increase anymore. So we measured this, we thought, okay, fine, it's saturated. Okay, a bit low, but fine. Then we measured these points, and we were like, hang on. There's no lattice strain now at these doses. And then we measured these points, and we thought, well, hang on, something's clearly wrong, because nobody ever reports that the lattice actually contracts when you irradiate, right? Because lattice expansion here you can understand in terms of Frankel pair accumulation. This contraction here would suggest that there's an enormous number of vacancies. There's an large excess of vacancies in the material that causes this contraction. And in fact, we were so convinced that this was wrong that we measured this twice, because we were absolutely certain that there was just something wrong with the experiment, but it comes out exactly the same first time. So to try and make sense of this, we again asked our colleagues from the Cullen Center for Fusion Energy for some help. So Daniel Mason and Sergei Dudarev did these atomistic simulations using the creation algorithm. So the way this works is that you start off with a perfect cell of tungsten atoms, perfect box of tungsten atoms, pick out an atom somewhere and insert it in a random new position and relax. And then you repeat over and over and over again, right? It's a simplified way of accumulating something that looks a bit like irradiation damage. So you're no longer doing full cascade simulations, but you're just saying, I'm just generating Frankel pairs in a random fashion and then letting your microstructure evolve. Yeah? The reason why this is attractive is because it means you can reach quite large damage doses, so several dPa, in reasonable times, and for reasonably large boxes, which is important for clustering. So what you see is that this is at 0.05 dPa. You have this kind of randomly distributed defect microstructure, but then once you get to higher damage levels, all your defects actually start to link up and start to form these extended defect networks. So what happens, and how can we explain these this peculiar strain? At low dose, you just generate Frankel pairs, so equal number of interstitials and vacancies. So you see a lattice swelling overall. Then, because the temperature is low in our simulations and also in our experiments, the interstitials are very mobile, but the vacancies are immobile, right? So the interstitials can move around, and as the dose increases, these interstitials start to gather into loops, whilst the vacancies remain distributed throughout the volume. Yeah? These interstitial loops then start to organize and actually eventually coalesce to make whole new atomic planes. So the really cool thing is that those new atomic planes now provide a mechanism for actually pulling all of those interstitials out of your lattice, right? And you can see that. So here, Daniel's plotted the excess planes that are formed. Yeah. So we're forming new atomic planes, and it's exactly at this point here that the lattice strain, so the blue strain that we measure with X-rays, decouples from the macroscopic strain that you would measure if you took, say, a ruler to the sample, right? So if you measured the sample with a ruler, you would measure an expansion. But if you use X-rays to look at the lattice, you measure a contraction. The reason is that these extraatomic planes effectively are strain-free. Yeah, they give you a change in the overall outside dimension, but they do not show up in your lattice strain because your lattice strain is now dominated by the retained vacancies. Does that make sense? This took us a long time to figure out. So that's why we see this negative lattice swelling. Can I eat into your time by 4 minutes? I'll speak more quickly. So this is just something that we've just finished. We've just done, which I really want to show because I think it's very important. So then on similar samples, irradiated to similar dose, the same material, slightly lower ion energy. So this is 2 MeV. We also did some TEM, and we looked specifically. So these samples were implanted and then back thinned, and we looked at different sample thicknesses. Yeah, and one of the really striking things you see is if you look at the thin regions in the low dose sample, 0.1 dPa and 1 dPa, what you see are pretty much all defects that look like spots. Okay, and a lot of the characterization on tungsten has been done on thin samples because you get significantly better images. So you might be fooled into believing that actually, you just get isolated loops that form. If you look at slightly thicker region, this here still looks pretty spotty. By the time you get to 0.1 dPa, you start to see the emergence of some extended structures. Yeah. By the time you get to 0.1 dPa, by the time you get to 1 dPa, you can definitely see some extended networks that are there. And if you move to an even thicker region, so this here is 120 nanometers thick, you have visible defect self-organization, even at very low dose, even at 0.01 dPa. So I was really surprised when I saw this, because what it really says is you need to be super careful that the foils, the samples are thick enough that your damage actually is representative of what is presumably there in the bulk. Yeah, because your surfaces do have a pronounced effect. The next question is then, what drives this defect organization? And our rationale was to say, well, okay, it must be driven by elastic interactions between loops, so we should be able to see self-organized strain fields. So the first go we had at measuring these strain fields was using a technique called high-resolution EBSD, where you take EBSD patterns in high resolution from your sample, and then use cross-correlation to look at the very small distortions between them to work out what the strain field is. And the way this is plotted here is that you have here this upper triangle here, and the diagonal. These are your 6 components of the deviatoric strain tensor, and then down here are your 3 lattice rotations. And you can really only see for the highest radiation dose, which is 1 dPa, you can see that this becomes quite spotty, suggesting that there's a self-organization. So this was a little bit weak in contrast. So we thought, well, okay, let's go and improve on this and actually do transmission Kikuchi diffraction. So you have your SEM beam that comes in, hits your sample, and then you have an EBSD detector that sits beneath your sample. This was done on sample regions, excuse me, about 80 nanometers or so in thickness. Yeah. And what I'm showing here are the 3 components of the 3 direct components, so 1, 1, 2, 2, and 3, 3 of the strain tensor. And then this here is the one of the shear components. The other 2 shear components are noisy for experimental reasons. And what the colors correspond to the deviatoric strain in each of those components. Okay. And what's really interesting is that even here at 0.01 dPa, I can convince myself that I can see regions where the strain fields are aligned, right? This arrangement doesn't look particularly random to me. You're allowed to disagree. As you then go to higher doses, this kind of organization of defects becomes more and more pronounced, and the organization of strain fields becomes more and more pronounced. And you also can see that the length scale of this organization keeps increasing with increasing dose, and actually becomes much greater than the length scale associated with collision cascades. Yeah, so there's clearly collaborative self-organization of defects in this material. And oh yes, and we also have a way of measuring this with 3D resolution, but not as good. So this was about 5 nanometer resolution in the plane of the sample, 5 to 10. These are X-ray measurements where we can resolve the full strain tensor in the sample with about 25 nanometer resolution in all 3 directions, and we get all 6 components of the strain tensor. So this is 0.1 dPa, 2 MeV tungsten, and all that I wanted to show is that here in the implants, the implantation was from underneath, and in this implanted layer here, you can clearly see that there's this heterogeneity of the strain field, strong heterogeneity of the strain field, compared to the much more uniform strain field in the undamaged region. One other thing that I should say is, so what I've shown here is just the isosurface of the strain component in this direction. And if you, so the implanted layer is down here, and if you squint, can you see that there's down here a very shallow layer that looks clear? That's your surface effect. That is the effect of the surface swallowing your defects. Yeah. All right. And then we also did some crystal plasticity modeling on this, actually adapting the helium-based model. And you can, so here, this is this is surface topography maps for different damage levels, all in 001 crystals. And then down here is the crystal plasticity prediction, and it matches reasonably well. All right. What I've not talked about at all is this large missing bit of this puzzle, which is the thermal diffusivity, which Abdallah is going to talk about. So I didn't want to steal his thunder. And let me just quickly wrap up. So I think we're getting to the stage where we have a reasonably coherent view of what happens in tungsten in terms of defect accumulation, and then how these defects are linked to the resulting properties. This is for one particular type of irradiation, probably the simplest we could do at room temperature. Hopefully this puts us in a better position now to actually understand what happens when we add more complexity. So when we look at synergistic effects, impurities, temperature, uncertainties in the environment, and then it's still a while off to actually be able to predict what happens in a reactor. We've also started doing some work on slightly more complicated materials, so iron chrome alloys as a model for ferritic martensitic steels. And I've not shown any of that because it's not nearly as neat and tidy a story. It is really, it's really, I thought it would be similar to tungsten. It's really different. And I think we can make sense of some of what we're seeing, but not all of it by a long stretch. And then even more complicated, we started looking at metal-metal composites with lots of interfaces. But that's for another time. So with that, I just wanted to acknowledge these folks for funding this research. And thanks to you for listening. How do you want to do questions? Do you want to do?
I would say, are you okay to do them at the end after?
Yeah.
If that's okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Felix. We're now going to hear from Abdallah. Ted's going to just pull up the slides. And yeah, if anyone online has any questions, just post them in the chat and we'll try and ask them at the end as well.
This guy or this guy?
You just tap this.
Yeah. Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Abdallah. I was a PhD student with Felix and now a postdoc with Felix too. And partially Felix and Rob, I guess, the postdoc, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
And yeah, so like I'll largely be talking about this technique called transient grating spectroscopy, which I think there's a guy here, Angus, who had done a little bit of it at MIT. And so it's a laser-based measurement for obviously measuring thermal diffusivity, and we also get the surface acoustic wave speeds and stuff from the same measurement. And up there is some of the people who collaborated to this this effort, and that's Kenza, the first guy. He did the implantations, obviously Felix. Then we have TEM and sample prep by Hongbing, TEM by Guanze, and this Cody who sort of helped me build the TGS setup. Can we minimize that? No.
Abdallah, just
On Zoom, it's okay. You can keep it.
Okay, cool. And yeah, so like I'll give a quick run through how the TGS method works, what sort of stuff we can do with it, and some of the maps of some samples we've already done, and then talk a bit about thermal diffusivity degradation and like primarily in tungsten, and then looking at annealing some of that those defects and looking at how you recover your thermal diffusivity and what that tells you about the defects inside your sample. So transient grating spectroscopy, as the name would imply, involves a transient grating, which you create using two laser pulses crossed at a sample. So here you see the two beams when they are like sort of meeting, and then like when I properly align it, and when they meet, then they create this regions of like high intensity and low intensity, and the high intense regions then heat up the sample in this spatially periodic manner, which then gives you thermal grating of like hot, cold, as well as the hot regions then can expand outwards, which then gives you regions of surface displacement. So you created a diffraction grating on your sample, and this grating is created by pulsed lasers. So that's why like once the pulse has lapsed, then heat from your hot regions would then flow into the cold regions, like hot to cold, and the time it would take for the heat to flow from this hot bit to the cold bit, it could also sort of go the same distance into your sample. So that's sort of how you know what depth you are probing in your sample. And so the elastic response of the sample surface to that periodic excitation kicks off counter-propagating surface acoustic waves, which sort of superimpose an oscillation in your signal. So if your sample had higher thermal diffusivity, then once the laser pulse is gone, like the heat would flow from the hot regions to the cold regions quite quickly, and then your grating would decay. So we probe the rate of decay of this grating by shining another laser beam on the same spot and looking at the intensity of the diffracted beam. And as we see in a sample with high thermal diffusivity, the intensity of the that diffracted beam decays quite rapidly, slightly faster than a sample with lower thermal diffusivity. So these are two samples of tungsten that obviously like differed slightly in terms of their thermal diffusivity. But for example, let's say like a sample of implanted silicon carbide would then decay over like an order of magnitude longer in time. And so the rate of decay of the diffracted signal is proportional to the rate of the decay of your grating, which then is proportional to the thermal diffusivity. And this is sort of a schematic of how the setup works. I won't go through this. Basically, these are your excitation lasers, and then this is your probing laser. And then we have a sample, obviously, in a vacuum for the thermal diffusivity. And we use like silicon photodiodes to measure the intensity of the signal beams. And this is like a snapshot of just this bit of the setup. And we also like put in a microscope so we can look at what point on our sample we're actually measuring. And a question I quite often get asked is, do the lasers affect your measurement, or do the lasers heat up your sample and so on, and does it affect your measurement? So this is again a pure tungsten sample and an implanted tungsten sample, and like a typical measurement would take let's say a couple of seconds and a minute if you want more averaging. But like I measured the same spot for like 6 hours, and there was no evolution in the measurement, which shows that the lasers don't affect it. And this is for your thermal diffusivity, and this is for your surface acoustic wave speed. So I missed mentioning that. So like these oscillations, the oscillation is at a frequency called the surface acoustic wave frequency, which is basically the speed of sound along your surface. Yes, and by changing this angle of incidence, you can change the spacing of this diffraction pattern and sort of this interference pattern, which would then change the let's say the spacing of a diffraction grating. So in the same way, then the time it would take for, let's say, if you had a wider grating, then it would probe deeper into your sample. So you are able to adjust the angle of your beams, and by that you adjust how deep into your sample you're probing. So if you have a sample that has been ion implanted with a depth where the ions go in only till around, let's say, 1.5–2 microns, then you can adjust this probing depth for that region. that's sort of the motivation behind going for this method, is because when you use ion implanted samples, you have this very thin ion implanted layer. Whereas if you had neutron irradiated samples, it sort of goes right through your sample, and then you could measure like LFA using LFA or like just normal techniques. But also, but then changing this grating spacing then changes at what frequency you're probing your measurement, probing your sample at. And there's obviously like a limit of like around 1.5 gigahertz, which we can measure using our setup, but it varies from setup to setup. So these are for tungsten, and this is for silicon. And you see silicon, as you go past this grating spacing, then it falls off this, which is beyond the scope of our setup. And yeah, some of the maps we measured. This is a large grained high entropy alloy, which is elastical anisotropic. So in this surface acoustic wave speed map, you see different elastic properties or different wave speeds in different grains, which sort of gives out our grain map. For the thermal diffusivity, there isn't a big difference from grain to grain, but we sort of see the region that was implanted with, I think, vanadium ions in this case for this sample. This is another map for a friction welded titanium alloy, which was from folks in materials, where this was 2 bits of titanium alloy, which was then rubbed against each other basically till it fused. And this is sort of your weld region, and this is your parent material. They looked at EBSDs, which showed like sort of a highly textured weld region and a quite anisotropic parent. And looking at the surface acoustic wave speed map, you also can see like sort of like a uniform surface acoustic wave speed in the weld, and then like obviously like varying speeds in the bulk, or say in the parent material. But also you can sort of see regions of similar wave speeds that coincide with these macro zones in your parent. And the thermal diffusion map is pretty even throughout. And yeah. So let me move on. Yeah, and this is a sample we did. This was deuterium implanted tungsten, where the exterior, the outer bits were like shielded from the deuterium plasma, and the interior was exposed to the plasma. And you see the exposed regions have these blisters on them, but they measured quite well in TGS. These were the samples we were mentioning earlier. And you had low thermal diffusivity in the center, and high in the unimplanted edges. Same with the acoustic wave speed. And so initially when I measured the samples, we measured a line across the sample, like just a line. And in the line, we saw this sort of massive dip in the center. And for months, we were trying to think, okay, what's causing this? Is it something to do with the implantation and so on? But it was only when we did these 2D maps, we found these spots of low thermal diffusivity across the sample. And then when we showed this map to the guy who gave us the sample, he was like, oh yeah, that reminds me, we did NRA, it's called like nuclear reaction analysis. They had done some NRA measurements, which involved implanting your sample with helium ions or hydrogen, I think helium ions. So basically this was an effect of the NRA measurement that we basically picked up in our line scan. So like, had we thought, okay, we implanted the center, the outside's unimplanted, let's measure one spot here, one spot here. And if you had selected one of these spots, you would be doing like coming to wrong conclusions. So that shows one of the benefits of doing a 2D map. And this was a sample from actually Angus. He was in the same department.
Yeah.
But he's left. Yeah, and he's gone to Mike Short. So it's quite in MIT. So this was a laser welded Europhore sample. That's obviously an optical micrograph he gave us, and then we did. This is a thermal diffusivity map, which obviously gave low thermal diffusivity in the weld region, higher in the outer, and we tried to then compare it with his nano hardness map he gave us, which also it correlated quite well. I'm just showing the maps instead of going into a lot of the science bits of it. And this is the surface acoustic wave speed map, but Europhore is quite anisotropic, so we didn't try to make sense of this. So that's the first bit of it. Then I'll just show a bit of the work I did on obviously irradiation-induced degradation of thermal diffusivity, where we picked around 13 samples, and for different implantation doses, so self-ion implanted tungsten. And in each sample, we also did it was uniformly implanted, but still we did 2D maps and then averaged it to 1 point. So every point on this graph is from an average from a map. And we did see a degradation in thermal diffusivity, which started to saturate around 0.01 dPa, and by 0.1 dPa it was completely saturated. And here, just to show how the method works, I have a sample that's 10 dPa, 0.01 dPa, and unimplanted, and you can see the rate of decay increases as you decrease the dose, and vice versa. And since we got really good error bars with this because of the temporal and spatial averaging, we decided to go and try to extract what the underlying defects is in our sample that gave rise to this thermal diffusion degradation. And then we sort of used a simple kinetic theory model that gave you your Frenkel pair density from your thermal diffusivity, basically estimating how many Frenkel pairs you needed in the sample to give this degradation. And this was basically the prediction in terms of say Frenkel pairs. You had a Frenkel pair density of around 0.2%, and the black plot is if there was no saturation, and obviously the one in violet magenta is what you would have if there was no recombination, just Y = X, just for comparison. But this all is of no use if we cannot compare this to some actual some let's say well-known predictions. So that's why I dug up some of Xiao Yi's work, and she had her tungsten TEM work and molecular dynamics work. And so, as Felix already mentioned, in the TEM stuff, there is this hole for defects that are smaller than around 1.5 or 2 nanometers in diameter. We then used the molecular dynamics simulation stuff to sort of plug that hole and compare TGS defect density estimates to this molecular dynamics plus TEM combination, and that gave us this plot. So again, this plot is the dose and the atomic fraction of let's say point defects. I used atomic fraction because then it's easier to compare atomic fraction to dPa, right? Because dPa is then one displacement per atom, and then atomic fraction is then let's say your damage per atom, or let's say Frenkel pairs per atom. So in red and blue is our data, and these square markers are what you get if you consider the TEM defects only. But then when you consider the TEM defects with the molecular dynamics predicted defects, then we sort of have an agreement within an order of magnitude of dose over this, let's say 5 orders of magnitude in dose. In Frenkel pairs for this entire range of dose, which sort of showed us the gap between what TEM sees and what TGS is seeing, as well as what TEM with MD would see. And but then here in purple and black, purple is basically if you count defects on the circumference of a loop, and black is the number of Frenkel pairs if you count defects in the entire area of the loop, just to compare and contrast. And in blue triangles over here is the let's say the density of your implanted ions, the ions you put into your material. And in the interest of time, I won't go into much in terms of the annealing work, but basically we stuck a heater to the back of our samples. So we were heating the sample while we were measuring the thermal diffusivity to look at the evolution of the defects and to see if anything were to happen. I remember Felix telling me, okay, let's heat it and see if something happens. If something happens, then okay, we have some research to do there. So yes, something did happen, And if you look at a 0.32 dPa sample, again, this was the self-implanted tungsten. So we had a thermal diffusivity of around 3e-5 meters squared per second. So like in gray is what you would get for pure tungsten. And we were down here. We heated it up to around, let's say, 473 Kelvin and cooled it down. There was no change. But then when we heated it up to like 673 Kelvin and then it cooled it down, there was almost like a 50% recovery of the thermal diffusivity. And then we went up to again 873 and 1073. This was basically like 200, 400, 600, and 800 C. And we saw this effect in even in the other higher dose samples. And in the lower dose samples, obviously, like they were at they started off at high thermal diffusivity, and we sort of recovered the entire, let's say, the entire thermal diffusivity. Like it was like a pristine sample at the end of annealing. But for the high dose samples, like how many times we heated it up to 1073, we did not get a better thermal diffusivity than 5e-5, which led us to think like maybe it's a different type of defect that we are healing. And yeah, so like if you like summarize all of those plots into one, here you have your room temperature thermal diffusivity. And for example, for a high dose, let's say 3.2 dPa, you start off here, and after annealing in several steps, you sort of like reach this maximum of 5e-5. So it seems like, and for the low dose samples, you start off here, and then you sort of recover your pristine diffusivity, which led us to think that maybe like obviously there are like different types of defects, and there are some defects in the high dose samples that do not anneal off even at 1073 Kelvin. And so then we picked out this sample, so like the annealed 0.032 dPa sample, which and the as implanted 0.0032 dPa sample, because they had the same thermal diffusivity, but obviously had different defects in them. And we did some PEM. And so this is the 0.032 dPa anneal, and this is 0.032 as implanted. And obviously these were like fibbed out sections, so like there's so much like fib damage. So this is the like, let's say, deep in the bulk, like sort of the parent material. And this is the implanted region in the annealed sample and in the as implanted 0.032. So here you cannot differentiate this from the bulk. It's all like just small defects all strewn around. Whereas in the annealed sample, you can sort of see these larger defects have formed, and like you have these regions where of sort of, let's say, less defects compared to these large defect regions. And that sort of led us to think that there are these larger defect structures that do not anneal off by 1073 Kelvin, and it's a lot of these small invisible defects that do anneal off. And when we looked at studies from positron annihilation spectroscopy, so this is basically the annealing curves, but in terms of the defect density. And when you looked at positron annihilation spectroscopy work, like it said that like mono vacancies in tungsten. So basically your vacancies become mobile in this temperature range of 500 to 600 Kelvin, which is leading to like most of the recovery we see like in our studies. And towards the end, we are, at high temperatures, we are sort of seeing large, like the start of certain like die vacancies and so on become mobile, and those healing off. But it's mainly the mono vacancy mobility that we see here. Yes, and yeah, that was a really quick run through over most of the stuff we did. And obviously, I've sort of given you a summary throughout. And yeah, obviously, I'd like to like thank Xiao for her work, which was like obviously amazing and like time-intensive TEM stuff. Sergey and Daniel from Kalam, and obviously like Cody is now at MIT. He also helped us in building the heating bits and so on. But yes, like if there are any questions for me or Felix, like I would welcome them. Thank you. Yeah, sorry, that was quite fast and like quite a run through.
No.
Are there questions?
We have one question for sure.
Okay.
So yeah, first of all, thank you for the great talk. The first question online is, could you explain why thicker samples represent more realistic damage profiles? I think that's for you, Felix.
Yeah. The we don't even need to go to the slide. It's okay. I think the key point is that you have sample surfaces act as a strong sink for defects. And you could think about this both in terms of one, elastic interactions, so the image force on defects, but even if you say elastic interactions aren't that important, even then if your defects perform some kind of Brownian motion, if they're close to the surface, they're quite likely to encounter that surface and will then be lost forever. So that's the difficulty. And in fact, there was a really nice paper from Daniel Mason. Oh, this one, here, that guy, 2014, where he did some OKMC simulations, and it just comes out of the simulations.
Thank you, Felix. Does anyone in the room have any questions?
So, sorry,
Oh,
I suppose I should follow that up by saying essentially, so this means that, you know, you have a timescale dependence, right? So if you're looking at very short timescales, then okay, maybe thin samples might be okay because you don't have time for stuff to escape. But the longer your timescales, effectively the thicker a sample you need to move to in order to have something that's hopefully vaguely representative of the bank.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess like more what you said earlier about kind of what you can do in the future, but as we would go to higher temperatures and kind of have a lot of that monovalency migration and agglomeration at higher radiation temperatures, how do you think that would change how we maybe see the thermal diffusivity change if we then have large vacancy structures as opposed to little smaller ones? Thinking about that. But then you also have voids in that 3D and that, like, I don't know how.
Do you want to answer this one? Well, I suppose let's look at the positive side. The annealing stuff, this annealing study that you did, I suppose, shows that we do have a way of getting rid of defects, actually a surprising amount. So I suspect actually that a lot of these effects, as you go to higher temperatures, become less bad. And that actually then at higher temperatures, what becomes more important, or may become more important, is material chemistry and formation of peculiar phases, segregation, and so on. Well, that's a guy. Yeah, I mean, I think really what needs to be done is that we look at irradiation in situ at high temperature with some of these tools. Thank you. And then map out the evolution. That's a work in progress.
Brilliant, thank you. Anyone else have any questions?
I've got a question. Thank you for that talk. When you said, Felix, that there's an extra plane fact that it's not actually an atomic strain, does that mean that, you know, you've got this macroscopic swelling in the sample, but actually there's no measured increase in stress?
Correct.
Right.
Correct. You effectively, it's really this took us an absolute age to get head round. So essentially what you have is that every so many unit cells, on average, you will form a new atomic plane. And because that is a process that's fairly uniform throughout the material, you don't actually build up any stress in the process, but you rather just have a way of continuously removing interstitials from the material. The problem then is that you're left with this supersaturation of vacancies, and the vacancies have nobody to recombine with, right? So they're forever locked into the material, unless you go to high enough temperature that you can then get some vacancy removal. So there's a really interesting discussion at MSCT about this, and one suggestion was that if you could go and effectively move to materials that have really high migration barriers for your vacancies and for your interstitials, that maybe actually that might be one way of having a more radiation resistant material, counterintuitively enough, because you prevent separation of your vacancies and distitials. You keep them close enough together that hopefully a reasonable portion may eventually recombine. In practice, whether that happens or whether actually what happens is that you just have a thing where you lock even more rubbish in because the migration barrier is too high for them to even, you know, make their way a few unit cells back together. Who knows? Don't know.
That was the idea with hydrogen ions, wasn't it? So
Yeah,
they-
that
they
kind of
could have
really-
sluggish diffusion kept the Frankel pairs close to each other to get higher recombination, but yeah, maybe.
I think that it never really kind of. I suppose I shouldn't say that.
You can say that.
So, for example, we've measured the thermal diffusivity of hydrogen ions. It is not very good. I mean, they're great if you want an insulator, but they're not very good if you want to build anything that is going to go and conduct heat at any very good radius sensitive rate, because you've got an enormous amount of impurity scattering. I mean, it's even worse than the worst steel you can think of. And I think steel frying pans. They're rubbish.
We've got one final very, very quick question from the chat on Zoom, which is, I'm wondering how samples with different radiation damages are obtained.
Oh, this is
I'm guessing you use just.
this
Yeah.
this enormous list.
Yeah.
By literally just exposing samples for different lengths of time.
Yeah.
Now hang on, the dose rate for. So because there's a question of dose rate, right? And so I think.
First
Abdallah,
two and last.
I think these two were at a lower dose rate
Yeah.
because we needed to implant for long enough that, sorry, I should point out here. These two, the first two were at a lower dose rate so that we could implant for long enough to have a vaguely uniform coverage.
Yeah.
Then these were all, I think, at the same,
Yeah, except the last three.
at the same dose rate, up to 1 dPa, and then the last three were at a higher dose rate so that we could fit it within, I think, about 2 days.
Yeah.
We did manage to sort of convince ourselves that that spread of dose rate was small enough that it shouldn't have much of an effect,
Yeah.
hopefully.
Good question and a good answer. Yeah, I think we've run over, so we'll finish that.
Sorry.
No, it's not your fault. Let's thank our speakers again for the wonderful talks, and yeah.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.